was really good. She got major citations for bravery from not only the Serbian army, where she was awarded with their highest award twice, once for capturing 20 Germans and once for capturing 23 Bulgarians, in each case single-handedly. But she also got the Legion of Honor from the French twice. She got the Cross of St. George from the Russians. I mean, she is, as far as we know, the most decorated female soldier in history. And she manages to stay not in disguise after she is found, but it's because she is so good.
One other thing, too, you mentioned earlier that there was a Byzantine account from the 11th or 12th century about the Persians in the 4th century, and it's discovered that many of the fighters are women. I would imagine that the chronicler is trying to say something negative about the Persians, since those two are always...
Absolutely.
Right, those two are always at war with each other, so the Byzantines typically have few kind words for the Persians. Here's something I wonder, when you're looking at sources across the world, and they talk about female figures, when it seems like the historian is fudging the facts and maybe even making something up like completely, as our beloved Herodotus does frequently, and with the Amazons, maybe he just heard it and wrote it as history, maybe he made it up, who knows. When it seems like the historians are trying to make a point by talking about female warriors or soldiers, what are some different points that they're trying to make that you've seen?
They're often making a point about the person the woman is fighting against. If you're being positive about a woman warrior, you're casting aspersions on the person they fought against. So Herodotus, again, tells us the story of Tomyris fighting Cyrus the Great of Persia. Well, Herodotus is no fan of Persia. So in his story, Tomyris is a powerful, positive figure. He's also our primary source for Tomyris. So they're often using women warriors to make political points, either for or against the men they fought against. They are often talking about women and then warriors or otherwise as a way of making political points about their husbands or their fathers. They're often left out of history as a way of not detracting from their husbands or their fathers or their brothers, is the other thing that happens. With the older sources, even with newer sources, you just have to use them with great care. Mm-hmm. And one thing I would say is, if you're concentrating on a woman warrior in isolation or a particular time period, then it's really easy to accept the later historian who says, well, maybe she didn't exist. Well, maybe she didn't really fight. Once you start looking at it across time and you start seeing the exact same explanations being given about why a woman didn't exist or why she didn't fight, they start to sound a lot less compelling.
Yeah, that's a good point. Well, let's look at someone who we know did exist, and figure you spent some time with is Matilda of Tuscany. So can you tell me about the time period in which she's alive and how she comes into all this?
Sure. I spent a lot of time with Matilda because she just took over every chapter that I tried to put her in, and she finally got a little chunk of her own. She exists in the late 11th, early 12th century, and she's unusual in that she actually ended up not only inheriting her father's lands and titles and wealth, but managing to maintain control of them, even through two politically induced marriages that get forced on her by other people. But why she's really important is her lands control the main passageway between Germany and Rome. And she gets involved in the primary political and theological controversy of her time, which was the Investiture Controversy. In its larger sense, it just pits secular and papal authority against each other. But in its specific sense, it put the Pope and the Holy Roman Emperor in collision about who is going to control the wealth and the power that comes from controlling the appointment of bishops. Matilda is pro-Pope. She grows up in a family that is allied with the Reform movement in the Catholic Church. She's actually a cousin of the Holy Roman Emperor, so it's not, she's the family squabble at that line. But she ends up as the primary defender of Pope Gregory against her cousin, the Holy Roman Emperor Henry V, and then of two successive reforming popes. She's controlling that roadway. She's their primary military support for a good 20 years. And at first she has trouble. She gets defeated pretty regularly, and she holes up in Canossa, which is this basically impenetrable fortress in the Apennine Mountains. But with time, she gets better, and she ultimately defeats Henry and leaves him pretty much stranded in Italy for a time. She's also involved in helping plan the First Crusade, though she doesn't go on it. She doesn't send forces. She's defending her own territory against uprisings, against, some of her followers end up backing up Henry, and so she's putting down rebellions in her own territory. She's a solid commander for 40 years. There's just no doubt she lived, she fought, she was a major player, and yet she often ends up being reduced to Henry's humiliation at Canossa, where she is cast as a peacemaker, which I find interesting. This is the incident where she was taking Gregory toward Germany, where there was going to be a meeting to deal with some of the problems with the local bishops who had tried several times to overthrow Gregory's papacy, and they'd also tried to overthrow Henry's empireship. So she's on the road to Germany when she finds out that Henry is actually on the road toward the Pope. She retreats with the Pope to Canossa. It turns out that Henry's coming as a penitent, not as an aggressor, because he's been given a very short time to get, he's been, I'm going to lose the word. He's no longer a member of the church, and he has to get it back or he's going to lose his throne. So he comes as a penitent. He's there in the winter, standing barefoot in sackcloth, begging for entry for several days. And Matilda is given some credit for brokering that peace talk. But that's just one incident in this very rich life of political action, of military action. She's just an important figure in her time.
I didn't know that about Gregory, but I mentioned that story where you said where he was a penitent to illustrate the vastly growing power of the papacy that makes later things like the Crusades possible, which before then, in a century or two, the papacy had very little power when you look at Holy Roman emperors or other figures. So yeah, Matilda, she really had a big impact on the Middle Age culture.
Absolutely. No doubt about it.
Well, I have to ask this, since we're talking about female warriors. My audience loves Vikings. So Viking shield maidens, did they exist?
Well, whether the shield maiden as we know them existed, who knows? But there is increasing evidence that at least some Viking women fought. And the tipping point on this is 2017. An iconic Viking warrior named the Burqa Man, who had been known as the Burqa Man since his excavation 130 years previously, turned out as a result of forensic anthropology and DNA testing to in fact be the Burqa woman. And this set off a major brouhaha in the Viking studies world, because people who had always been willing to accept the remains as a warrior when it was the Burqa Man fought really hard to explain why that wasn't true if it was a Burqa woman, which I find fascinating. I mean, everything about it is the same except the gender has changed. So there is increasingly a sense that some women did fight, whether they are the shield maidens of lore is a different question, but there seems to have been at least some number of Viking women who fought.
Hey everyone, Scott here. One more brief word from our sponsors. Based on the findings of the Burqa so-called man, or now it's the Burqa woman, Vikings love to provide military gear and other things that the Viking warrior would need in Valhalla. Based on what was there at the burial of the Burqa woman, what would she have been doing in life as a warrior?
I don't even know how to answer that question. The fact is, the Burqa man was always held up as the example of a fully equipped warrior.
Huh.
So that's what made this such a troubling discovery, this was the go-to example. This was the fully equipped one with all the stuff. So she would have been doing whatever she would have been doing as a Burqa man. And it's interesting because we tend to think of Vikings in terms of going to war, but that's a seasonal task at best. It's a good weather task. Being a warrior wasn't a primary occupation at any given time. They're fishing, they're farming, they're raiding because where they live isn't particularly wealthy, but she would have been fighting, she would have been going on raids, is the assumption. And fighting internally as well. It was never a Pacific culture internally either.
Right. I think I remember there's an account by a 9th century diplomat from the Abbasid Caliphate who encounters Vikings from the Volga territory. And
yes.
I think he talks about, he's a little bit shocked and scandalized by the bending of gender norms where the spaces of men and women aren't as separate as they'd be in the Caliphate in Baghdad at that time.
Right.
So yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
And as I recall, he's also horrified by the fact that they weren't as clean as he felt people should be either.
Plus their tattoos. That's one of the best sources we have about that, and Viking tattoos as well. Well, I think there was one other figure we had mentioned. Is it Annie Patchen in Tibet that really stuck out to you?
Yeah, she's fascinating. And again, a much later example, 1950s. She was a Buddhist nun, and her father was the chieftain of a clan in Tibet. And when the Chinese invaded, he was an important chieftain. He leads the resistance at the local level against the Chinese. And after his death, his daughter, a Buddhist nun, took up his role. She took the position that the only way to preserve a nonviolent Buddhism in Tibet was to go to war. And she led her clan in active rebellion against the Chinese, obviously largely guerrilla warfare, because we're talking several hundred people against a large Red Army. And she successfully led them for 2 years before she was captured. And then she was in prison in China for some 20 years after that, before she was released, and then found her way to the Dalai Lama in exile and continued to fight in other ways against China. But fascinating to me, the drive of this woman who in some way that resistance would have been totally antithetical, but seeing it as the only way to preserve her culture. And actually her father calls her back to learn her duties as chieftain because he doesn't have a son. And in her memoir, there's a description of him teaching her to shoot from the roof of their house. So first, just teaching her to shoot at targets in the yard, and him saying, will you be able to shoot it if it's a Chinese soldier? And her saying, I just don't know. But armed with guns and setting out on horseback, she leads a couple of hundred of her people in resistance against the Chinese.
Well, yeah, thank you for telling all these stories across very large expanse of time. And to tie in a lot of these things together, something I want to ask that you wrote in describing your book is that women have